This is part 2 of the video series on producing rosette rings for guitars. This video will describe the production of these 2 rosette rings for guitars. Most of the methods used in this video are the same as in part 1, with some minor changes to speed up the production. We did turn the OD and ID of the segmented rings on the lathe to produce perfectly round rosette rings. Starting out with a 1.5 inch square by 20 inch long piece of ebony, and I attach this to my bandsaw with my Accu-Slice system, and I'm using the Accu-Sled 2 carriage with the flat plate clamps. And I'll be cutting a variety of boards with thickness as thin as 1/10,000 of an inch up to 100,000 of an inch thick. Well, that first cut was just to give me a flat surface on the board, and then I rotated my index wheel 1 full turn, which is 50 thousandths for the curve of the blade, and then 1 full additional turn, which should give me a board around 50 thousandths of an inch thick. So let's measure this and see what we have. We got 52 thousandths, 50 thousandths, 50 thousandths. Rotating it upside down. We got 52 thousandths, 51 thousandths, and 51 thousandths. And the surface is perfectly smooth. There's no need to even sand it. That's a good glue surface. So let me cut a bunch more boards. I need some more boards, again the same 50 thousandths. And then when I get down to the end, I'll be cutting some thinner boards, probably 25 thousandths inch thick. Again, I released my mag jig clamps, and I'm using the double sets of mag jig clamps, which is something which I just tried in my previous video. And it looks like it does hold the table more steady, so I'll be doing some more testing with that. So release those, turn this 1 full turn for the curve of the blade, which is 50 thousandths of an inch. And 1 full turn again will give me another 50 thousandths of an inch. And I'll keep repeating that for additional cuts. To reduce viewing time, I sped this video up 10 times the actual cutting speed. I'm actually cutting quite slowly, because the slower you cut, the smoother the finish on the board you're cutting. From an 1.5 inch thick board of ebony, I was able to cut 4 boards 75 thousandths of an inch thick. I cut 4 pieces 50 thousandths of an inch thick. And I cut 5 pieces 25 thousandths of an inch thick. And so I use these as accent pieces for the rosettes I'll be making shortly. In a likewise manner, I'll be cutting some other boards for the other strips to use in these rosettes. The second board has, of course, ebony on the outer layers, and of course a maple and ebony in the center, and then some maple, padauk, again some maple, walnut, maple, and finishing with an ebony. And again, a unique pattern. You can see the contrast between the different layers. Again, that board was 15 layers. And his final board is 15 layers. Again, this has some nice contrasting woods. Again, ebony on the outside, maple, padauk, yellow heart. And that's the pattern you see when that's assembled. So the next step is to take these to my glue-up jig. I'll be gluing these with epoxy. And then after they dry, I'll be sanding them flush. And then from those pieces we'll make our segmented disc to make our rings. So once again, to glue these laminate boards together, I'll be using my glue jig system, which consists of 2 angle irons on a sliding rail, and I put wax paper on it to keep the glue off the jigs. And once again, as I've done in the past, I'm using epoxy to glue up these boards. So I have 15 laminate strips I'll be gluing together. And I do put the epoxy on both sides of the boards and then stack them up one on top of another. After glue has been applied to the last board, I then place them in the cradle wax paper in the glue jig system and then begin applying clamps to squeeze out the excess glue and clamp the laminates tight. And I normally put clamps side by side, alternating high to low to get even pressure throughout the piece I'm gluing together. And then I allow the glued up assembly to dry for at least 4 to 5 hours. After the glued up laminate boards have dried, I do run the edges through my joiner planer to clean up the excess glue. I then run them through my edge sander to clean up the flat surface to remove any glue stains. And this is the finished cleaned up laminate board. Okay, I'm ready to work on the next Rosette piece. And this is a little bit wider. This is actually 0.63 inches wide. And it has black or ebony on the outside. The spacers in between will be ebony and they're 50,000ths of an inch thick. So again, I want this to be 5 inches ID. The inside will be about 3.6 inches. And I did the calculation. So these wedges need to be sliced to 0.287 inches wide. And I already have it set up, so it should be all set to go. I cut my first piece off at that dimension. I'm going to have a black line on here this time to see. And once again, I cut 48 wedges, rotating back and forth between the two fences. Okay, this is my next laminator board, from which I'll be making a rosette. And this measures 0.638 width. And I'm going to make it again 48 segments per ring. I did an initial measurement on this. It measures between 286, 287. And the spacers I'm going to be put between the wedges measured 33 thousandths, 0.033. So combining those two numbers together, I should end up with a ring with an OD of 4.9 inches and an ID of 3.6 inches. So about the same ID as the previous one I just finished. So whenever I'm making these segments, the first thing I do is I put a line down the entire length of the board. Again, off center. So I have a black pen here, and I'm putting a line just off center the entire length of the board. And that black line will always be facing up when I reglue the pieces back together. And now I'm ready to start cutting my segments. And I cut a total of 48 segments of wedges, each of them being 0.287 inches wide. Okay, I'm ready to cut my side pieces. So I have the right width right now. I just have to cut the length. So I have my system all set up. I'm ready to give it a cut. And this is what the finished wedge with the spacer glued on would look like. And the same procedure was used to cut the spacers for the second segmented disc. So next I have to sand my pieces to get rid of the fuzzies. There's a fuzzy on the, you can see a good fuzzy and burr on the edge here on all these wedges. And all of my spacers, have some fuzzies on the edge, so I have to sand those off. So I'm going to get, I'm using 220 grit sandpaper on a flat surface. And I'm just sanding to get rid of the fuzzy. I don't want to take much off the surface. Just using it as a guide to keep everything straight. That cleans it up just enough to get rid of the fuzzies. Make sure I have my mark on here, keeping that facing up. And so I'll be gluing these pieces to give me my spacer like that. And I continue to sand the remaining wedges and spacers. This kind of shows what I expect to get when it's glued up, with the spacers in between the segmented wedges. Next I have to glue up my pieces. So I'm gluing these to the pieces first. So what I have here is I have my wedge, here's my spacer, Here's a piece of plastic. It's just a clamping medium because this will warp as I put glue on it. So to keep it straight, I use this plastic piece. And I use plastic so the glue doesn't stick to it. So again, I'm using Type Bond 3 glue. And then I'm making sure I have the spacer going around all the edges because I'll be sanding off the excess. And that's what it looks like as it's being glued. I then glue up the remaining spacers and wedges. So these now should be ready to start sanding. And I want to sand everything flush to the wedge. Just making sure I keep the black line on there. And then when you're all sanded flush, that's what they look like. There's your bottom. There's the top. And I just finished the rest. Okay, I created a new form, and this is 3 3/4 inches OD. So I'm going to give these pieces a final sanding, and we'll fit them up. In the previous sanding, I forgot to sand the two faces on these segmented wedges, so I had to resand them to clean up the excess glue that was on the surfaces. Now, see if my jig's too small or too large. Too big. So let me go put this back on the lathe and I'll reduce the size. Okay, I'm ready to start gluing up now, and I did turn my center jig down to 3.6 inches in diameter, which is exactly what I calculated it should have been. It's a hair oversized, which is fine because these wood pieces are going to expand a little bit when the glue attaches to the pieces. So I marked my starting point. I think I'm going to probably do this in quarter sections. So let me do a quarter. I want to do it before the glue, sets up. So I give it like 5 minutes. So this first piece I just glue on one side. And I do make sure my lines are all facing up. I apply glue to 24 or half the wedges. Well, that went faster than I thought, so I did 24. I did half the pieces. So you rubber band around these, and we'll start clamping them. What I'm going to do, I have an extra spacer. I'm going to put it in over its opposite side, just so I have more pressure on these sides that are gluing. I continue to add multiple rubber bands around the pieces to clamp them in place. So let that set for like 10 minutes, and then we'll glue the other side. So I'm making sure the pieces are all pushed against my jig and pushed down against the bottom plate. Making sure all my pieces are pushed in, so my line should be a straight line around the circumference. And check that on the bottom also. Okay, let's set dry for half an hour. That half is done. So let me go and do the second half now. After glue is applied to the last piece, I then attach multiple rubber bands, and the gap that was present previously is now gone. The rings are perfectly tight against the jig with no gap. Okay, and there's the bottom view. So I'll let that dry for a couple hours. The same process was used to glue up the second segmented disc. Now I'm going to use my edge sander to sand off all these marks, get the surfaces perfectly flat and smooth, and I'll do that on both sides. So after sanding that, that's what we look like on both sides. Now in the design this, I purposely made this outer and inner rings a little bit thicker. And I did that because I'm going to put this on the lathe to clean up the glue marks on the outside and inside. So I have enough thickness there I can take off a little bit. It is perfectly round because I used that inner jig when I glued it up, so it's really quite round. So I put this on a lathe and I clean up the outer edge and get a perfectly round disc. So let me put this on a lathe next and we'll start cleaning it up. I mount this on my lathe using a set of coal jaws and push it tight against the chuck, clamped it down tight. And I'm using a carbide tooth, square tooth blade. And I'll be carefully going inside and outside to clean this up. After one side's been trued up, I reverse the ring in the chuck and clean up the other side. I then do a final cleanup with some 100 grit sandpaper. And there's the OD and ID all cleaned up. And again, it's perfectly round. And the second segmented disc was cleaned up on the edge sander and the lathe in the same manner. I'm ready to glue up my segmented disc from my Rosette to a piece of MDF so I can put it on my Accu-Slice system to start cutting off my thin slices. So this is a piece of MDF 3/4 inch thick, 6 inches tall, about 7 inches long. And I normally like to glue it to this MDF just so I make sure it holds very well. And I put some weight on that. And then I'll be attaching this to the Accu-Slice system and cut off a couple rings. And I'll probably just cut off a couple for what I need. I want to send a couple of these to a couple customers. And I'll leave the rest of the system intact. I could always take it and cut more off in the future. Or maybe even take it to a trade show and show cutting these off at a trade show. So again, let that dry for at least a half an hour before I put it on the Accu-Slice system. My segmented disc is attached to my MDF board, which is attached to my Accu-Sled 2. This is my 18-inch carriage, and I'm using 4x4 inch brackets. And I just adjusted it, set my gauge to 0, and my segmented disc is just flat against the bandsaw blade. Now I am using a 3/4 inch wide blade, 14 teeth per inch. I normally use a 1/2 inch wide blade. I prefer a 1/2 inch wide blade because the kerf is smaller. But I'm using this for doing some segmenting work, some other additional work, and I didn't want to change the blade just to do 1 or 2 cuts here. So go ahead and cut some disc here. And I want my disc to be between 65 and 75 thousandths of an inch thick. So these are my mag jig clamps. Now I know I need to go 1 full revolution, which is 50 thousandths for the kerf of the blade, which is actually 55 thousandths for this blade, so it's going to be a little bit off. And then another full revolution will give me a board 50 thousandths of an inch thick, and then 25. And that should give me a board around 70 thousandths of an inch thick. And that 14 teeth per inch blade gave a real nice cut. really smooth. So let me cut a couple more just from this. Okay, release my mag jig clamps. 1 full revolution for the curve of the blade. And then another full revolution will be 50 thousandths. And 25, let's make this 30. So she ended up around 70 thousandths of an inch thick ring. And that actually measures 73 thousandths of an inch thick. And it's exactly the same, 73 all the way around. Well, that's a nice cut on both sides. Let me cut one more. And there's our 3 rosettes. Cut off that segmented disc blank. Okay, I mounted my segmented disc to a piece of MDF and then mounted it to my Accu-Slice 2 carriage. And I'm using a 3/4 inch wide blade, 14 teeth per inch. So I just cut off a flat surface so it's perfectly flat and smooth. So now I'm ready to do my first cut. So I want my boards to be around between, say, 70 to 75 thousandths of an inch thick. And I know the curve of my blade is 55 thousandths. So I gotta do 1 full turn for the curve of the blade, plus another 5 thousandths, and then I'm gonna make this 75 thousandths. So there's 50. And that should be 75 thousandths. Got my mag jigs in place. And let's go ahead and cut our first disc. And that disc measured 71 thousandths inch thick. And here's our finished rosette. So let me cut a couple more. And there's our 3 rosettes. Each of these measure between 70 and 73 thousandths of an inch thick and perfectly flat around the complete circumference. This concludes this video on the production of these 2 rosette rings for guitars. A similar rosette ring was described in video number 1 of this video series. Both of these 2 rings are similar design. This ring has a maple center band, and the 2 inner and outer rings are ebony. This second rosette ring for the guitar has ebony on the inside and the outside of the ring, and also the center middle ring is ebony, and it has some nice puduk and yellow heart in the middle. This concludes video number 2 of this series on the production of rosette rings for guitars. Limited quantity of these rosette rings are available if anyone is interested. An additional video of a different design is planned for the near future. Once again, thank you for watching this video. If you have any questions or concerns or comments, please give us a call or drop us an email.